Hi. Okay. So today I have Adrienne Dorison here with me. And the reason I wanted to bring her on to talk innovation with us today is because she did something super cool, I thought, with her latest podcast, in that it was a pop-up. It was called the Pop-Up Podcast, right?
Yeah.
And she took it down, which is like crazy, right? In the world of everything lives on the internet forever. So I super wanted to talk to you about that in particular. But why don't you start out by telling us a little bit about what you do in general, and then we'll talk about the podcast.
Yeah. So I work with entrepreneurs, help them get more results in less time by really understanding their numbers and how their numbers are affecting their problems in their business, or their numbers are telling the story of what the problems are in the business. And then we work to focus on the areas that need improvement, have opportunity to leverage, et cetera. So I love working with women because we need to get even more comfortable with our numbers and making tons of money. And then I also love focusing on, okay, let's make tons of money. And then how do we give it back to the world in really meaningful ways? Because I think we're at this really unique place in the economy and with entrepreneurship that we can create limitless income. We just have to be willing to do so. We have to know how to do so, and then we can give it back. So those are the things that I do with my clients, and really working on like a consulting coaching basis.
I love that. I was not a fan of numbers before I got into business. And then somebody showed me how easy they could be. And I was like, what?
And how they're like the magic behind everything. Like when people are typically solving the wrong problem in their business. So whenever I come, it's all about like asking the right questions. And so when I come in, like I want like a full financial picture, a full numbers picture on all of the pillars of your business that we need to understand better. And then like the problem is so obvious once I can get in and like kind of dig in and see that. But most of the time we're solving the wrong problem. Like you see questions all the time. People are like, why don't I have more sales? And I'm like, because you have no traffic, right? Like, so it's not that you need to change all the copy on your website necessarily. It's that you don't have enough people to even know why it's not converting yet, right? So a lot of times we solve the wrong problem first, and then we quit because we're like, I tried everything.
It didn't work. Right. Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Love that. Love that. Okay, cool. So you're a podcast pro. You've had a couple of shows, right?
Yeah, I've had a couple shows, and I love being a guest on other people's shows. It's kind of my
Me too.
For me. Yeah, so fun.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Like, yeah, let's just talk.
Right.
And now I'm doing a show, my third show. So I have a show that I've had for almost 2 years. And then the Pop-Up Podcast was recent. And then the Shift show, which I'm co-running with Jason Van Orden.
Right. Which I hope to get the two of you on to talk together about that.
I would love that.
Yeah. That would be very cool. So the Pop-Up Podcast caught my eye because of the concept. It's like a pop-up restaurant or shop that gets taken down. So tell us a little bit about that and why you chose to do it that way.
Yeah. So the Pop-Up Podcast, like you said, it was themed for one specific season. So the season itself had a theme. Mm-hmm. And then we aired a specific number of episodes all on the same topic. And then we actually pulled them all down from iTunes. And right now there's just a placeholder episode that says, hey, we might be back with a new season. Let us know what you want to talk about in season number 2 if we make it back, right? Mm-hmm. Because I wanted it to, number one, I sort of wanted it to be a test project so that I had my own permission to release it. Basically, like if it didn't light me up, or if I didn't want to continue on, like the season felt safe, right? Like it felt safe to do that and be like, I'm just testing this. I don't know if it'll work. But one of my big things in business is really taking action now, and that we're in like an information overload space. And that's what everyone, like we're not for lack of content, right? So it's like, how do I get people to listen to this show now, not a year from now or 6 months from now? Because that's typically the response that people will say, like, oh, I meant to listen to that, or, oh, I'm going to listen to that next week or next month. Whereas I knew if I gave them some sense of urgency, I kind of related it similar to if I was doing a launch or a sales opportunity. How do we increase views or sales of something? Is we give it a deadline. And so I wanted to really take that model and put it into the podcast itself because I hadn't seen that done. So I was basically just trying to test something new as well, like seeing, does this work? Can I get my audience to actually listen to this stuff in real time because there's a sense of urgency that I've created.
Right. And how did that work? Ms. Numbers Lady, do you have like numbers to say how it worked and how it turned out for you?
Yeah. And so this is something that Jason and I actually talk about on the Shift Show is that like, if you're going to iTunes to build an audience, you're going to the wrong place, right?
Yes.
So the intention of the podcast was never to build a huge audience on iTunes.
Right.
It was to engage my current audience because the pop-up podcast also had a community built in. Like I had a pop-up Facebook group that went alongside it. And I was promoting an affiliate offer for my friend Selena Sue. And the content all led towards that launch, right? And so my goal was actually to engage the current audience that I had with this new podcast and give them something fresh and new and lead them back again towards the pop-up group and then to the affiliate sale. So in terms of numbers, we did get on like the top charts, not just the new and noteworthy, but like all of top charts. And that's because the algorithm works like every second. It's kind of like Amazon bestsellers list, right? Where if you're a bestseller for like a millisecond, then you're a bestseller, right?
That's me.
Fine. Yeah, like totally fine. Like we should play that game, right? I'm not saying I obviously mentioned I made it to the top charts, right? Because it's still meaningful for people to know that, right? So we did make it to the top charts, and that's if you know iTunes algorithm, like we don't know the exact algorithm, but we know that we need lots of downloads on one day. We need spikes and surges of downloads. We need ratings and reviews in surges. So I knew how to game that system a little bit. And so that worked in terms of getting it onto the top chart. So it was a top podcast, right? In terms of numbers, we had over 1,500 people in that pop-up group.
That's great.
The Facebook group, right? Yeah. Where we were promoting an affiliate offer.
That's a second level of engagement, right? So you're not just having them listen, they're actually then taking an action, which on podcasts is pretty hard to do.
Pretty hard to do, right? So I was taking them from that podcast to join the group because inside the group, I was giving them free trainings, like additional content. So I was like, hey, so my entire concept for how I structured it was like, I'm going to give you the why, like why you need to do this on the podcast, right? And then inside the Facebook group, inside the community, I'm going to give you the how to do this. So it was like a clear path of like, okay, now you know why you should be, and the whole topic was exposing your business, why you should get more immediate attention to your business. So why that's important on the podcast, then leading them towards the group for trainings on how to do that, because that's going to be their next question, right? So I think a lot of people don't understand like what their plan or path is for the content, first of all. Like,
yes.
So that's like, we knew, okay, this is where we're talking about why, because that's the first thing we need to convince them of. And then the how is what their next question is going to be. And if I give them all the how on the podcast, then they might never join the group.
Right.
And the problem with iTunes is there's no feedback loop, right? Like I can't talk to those people. So I wanted an area to talk to them. So the group was super important. So the numbers were about, I'd say 500 downloads a day, just off the top of my head, which was, I mean, that's like it's in the top 10% of all podcasts, which is like crazy to me that like, I read somewhere that it was like most best-selling books, or not best-selling books, most like books, like less than 250 people reading them. And I'm like, oh my God, what a waste, right? Not a waste, because like that's a lot of people still.
No, still, yeah.
Like a book, you just like poured your life out, right?
Yeah.
Same thing with podcasts, like that most episodes on average, the average listen is like 150 listens per episode. So we were getting way more than that. 500 a day. We only had one episode a week, and we were live for 2 months. So 500.
It's a lot.
It's a lot, right? So it's a good amount of listens, and then leading people towards the group. Obviously, not everyone joined the group, but I find that podcast leads are much more quality leads than like a Facebook ad or something like that. So we went into the affiliate launch, and those are the numbers I care about, right? Like, what did we convert into sales? And we were number 2 in the affiliate launch. We had every single person that purchased was part of our challenge and free Facebook group. So it tells me that content, whether they came in specifically through the podcast or somehow else found the group and then came in and then listened to the podcast, like, it worked in terms of converting them into a sale.
Cool. So were you offering the affiliate sale then to your wider list as well?
Yes. And that's why we wanted to track, like, we did segment them, like, are you interested in this? Are you not? So we segmented out people that were not, but we wanted to track, okay, from the sales that we're getting, how many of them, you know, maybe they didn't come in through the group. Maybe they were already on my list. They
Not
wanted to
brand new.
participate in the group. So we tracked who participated in the group, at least joined us inside the group and listened to the podcast, and then bought, and it was everyone. So that was an important step in the affiliate launch process.
Yeah. That's really interesting information. Yeah, very cool. So what I'm hearing you say then is that you were actually working on this launch, which happened to be an affiliate launch, but you were providing content for it 2 months before cart open.
Yeah.
No, that's great, because I want to make that point, because I see way too many people who either never do anything pre-launch and just send an email and expect, oh, I'm going to make whatever, or do it like for 2 or 3 weeks ahead. I think people are nervous about providing that much sort of pre-launch content. But it worked for you really well.
It worked really well. And so what I would have done in hindsight, which I'm always like, okay, now looking at the statistics, what would I have done differently? Right. So we did like a 30-day pitch challenge from the podcast to the group. The trainings were getting them to do a 30-day challenge. I probably would have shortened up that challenge to a week or 2 weeks, just to keep them engaged a little bit more, like while they were hot and ready. Right. So we probably lost some people in that longer period. But you could also argue that we kept the people that were really interested in this, you know? So like, sometimes you don't want those people who are just excited in the moment and then get a refund later. Right.
Sure.
But, so that would be something I would tighten up a little bit, but I still wouldn't have tightened up the content itself, because I found that by warming them up to this idea and like why they needed it, it was like so clear why I was introducing them to this person, Selena, and like really spending the time to educate them and to keep it top of mind for them, and for them to consider that this might be an important next step in their business. And we overcame a lot of the objections through the podcast, right? So some of the topics that we talked about of like, what to do if you're just like how to leverage PR or media if you're just getting started in your business, right? Like if this is like your first, like, is it the right time for you? So I did an entire episode on that, which is absolutely going to be one of the objections when people are thinking about it. And so I'm hitting that before we even offer them a program.
So smart. Super smart.
So I used that, and I also took their questions in the group. And so I said that on the podcast. I was like, I want to take your questions. Like next week, I'm going to be doing a Q&A episode. So come over to the group, post your questions, and I'll be picking some of you and like featuring you on the episode. So I even featured people saying like, oh, this question comes from Lacey Boggs. Like she's a content director, all that stuff, so that they could be featured, but then I would read their question and answer their question. And those were overcoming a lot of objections and questions that people had too. So it was trying to create that user engagement and feedback loop, even when iTunes doesn't really allow for it.
Right. So that seems like it would be a good strategy, even if you have an ongoing podcast, to have a place for people to go to engage, so that therefore, and it also kind of creates that urgency, right? If they're listening, if they know that, I don't know, once a month you do a Q&A,
right?
they need to listen and keep up so they can get their question in, right?
That's right. And I think the important piece is like not just letting that group sit, but also like proving to them that they are going to get their questions answered, that you're in there and listening and using that as, I mean, if you have a group or if you have like a podcast or a blog and you're like, I don't know what to write about, I don't know what to talk about, they'll create all the content for you just by asking questions, right?
For sure.
Like,
I had this happen just
to talk about
in my group. Somebody was asking about email list cleaning, which is a thing I did early, and I was like, I should write a blog post about that.
Exactly. I'm like, oh, you guys are giving me all the content ideas that I need. And now I can just strategically position them, logically in an order that fits, right, for what I'm trying to do. But those feedback loops would be super helpful. And that's why like Jason and I with the Shift Show, we're also leveraging the power of Facebook. We're going to use iTunes, but since iTunes isn't playing nice in terms of updating and keeping up with things, I'm just going to keep bragging on iTunes until they listen to this episode and change things. I don't know.
Because I'm sure they're listening to my blog.
You, but they should. And using the Facebook Live and the Facebook page or a Facebook group, if that's what you have, or some way to like get people engaged in the content that you're creating, and then use iTunes because it's there. It's an easy, platform for people to listen and consume content from, but not necessarily ideal in terms of creating that real relationship that you want. And that was the intent with the pop-up podcast, is like, not only am I going to live by my values here by saying, here's how long it's up for. If this relates to what you're focused on right now, then listen now and do the work, and then it's coming down, right?
Right.
Because otherwise, like, I don't want to distract people with content that isn't their main focus right now. That's part of like my entire process and systems, is like, no, you need to be laser focused on like what your main focus is. So if this doesn't apply, then don't listen. But if it does, then you need to listen now. And then I'm taking it down.
Do it now. Right. I watched one of your first, it might've been your second live stream with Jason, and you guys were talking about sort of the pros and cons of podcasts. And I'd love to bring that up with you just a little bit, because I linked to that episode on my Facebook page, because I was like,
thank you.
Yes, everybody and their dog needs to listen to this, because
everyone and their dog. That would be me. Yeah.
So many people right now saying, I want to start a podcast. And it's so exciting and it's fun and it feels new and it feels doable. And you see people having this huge success. But the problem I see is that it's not solving a business problem for them. It's a shiny object, right? You talk a little bit to that, like, when is a podcast a good business decision and when is it maybe a distraction?
Oh, such a good question. And
it's a big one. Sorry.
This is good. This is good because I have like a million things to say right now. I'm just trying to figure out where to start, because I'm like, it's so exciting when people are like, Adrienne, I'm going to start a podcast, or like, Lacey, I'm going to start a podcast. And I don't want to like crush their dreams right there.
No.
But basically I need to crush their dreams if I'm like being honest, and if I'm, being strategic and thinking about the current market and what's a good use of your time. It's probably not just a podcast, right? So the problem is, especially if you're in the B2B space, you want to start a podcast that's an interview style podcast, and you want to be just like John Lee Dumas, Entrepreneur on Fire model. And it's just been done. Like, it's been done too many times, and people have too many choices in terms of the interviews that they're going to listen to. Like, they're pretty selective, because they don't have a million hours. And if you're position, you have to really think about the positioning of that show. Or I just read one of your blogs the other day, like, of your blog, like, your blog is not that's not the end, right? Like, that's just like, no one's like racing to read your blog every day, right? Like, so that's like one piece of it. So I do think that you need to have some sort of content for people to get to know what you do and if they want to work with you and if you're knowledgeable and share some value with them. And if a podcast, like asking yourself, like, why does a podcast feel exciting? Is it because it's a speaking platform? For me, that's why I wanted to podcast, because I was not good at being consistent with blogging. I'm more of a context person versus a content person. And so it was much harder for me to like write content than it was for me to get curious with people and ask them questions. So my first show was like very interview based, right? So that was much easier for me to be consistent with my content by being more contextual. But hindsight, I didn't have, like, my show does well, the first show, but I didn't have as unique of an idea as you would need to have to really stand out. And like Jason and I were talking about on that episode, like, you're not going there to build an audience. If you already have an audience, that might be a great additional piece of how they get to know you or where you're sharing content. But iTunes, unless you're like in the top 1% of 1%, which is pretty hard to get up there, you are not building an audience via iTunes. Like, if you don't have an audience, iTunes isn't going to help you just get one, right? So I think that there's much easier ways to build an audience and much smarter ways to do that right now, especially with the onset of Facebook Live and like the power that it's giving us. So if the reason you're choosing a podcast is because there is a little bit of credibility stored in, oh, I have a podcast and I had so-and-so on my podcast, right? Then ask yourself, like, could you just move that to Facebook Live instead and use Facebook Live as your podcast or your show and make it more of a show? You don't make it just a random live stream, and there should be some differences between just a random live stream and a live stream show. Right. So I think that those are some different ideas for what you could do instead. And like, sure, still, like, because Jason and I, just full disclosure, like, we're putting this show on iTunes because I'm not going to say no to
free traffic if you get it, right?
Exactly. Or like like, we know it's easy for people to pull it up on their phones while they're walking and use iTunes platform to listen to the content that we're providing. But it's not where we're going to get traffic, essentially. And we know that like Facebook Live can help us basically build almost an email list through the retargeting audience that we can build much faster, plus the feedback loops and all those things. A reason I would say maybe it is a good idea to start a podcast would be building relationships with people, because it's in the beginning, especially when I was first starting my podcast, it was really important and much easier for me to have a reason to reach out to influencers or mentors or people that I thought were interesting and say, hey, I would love to interview you for my show, versus can we just have a conversation? Because they don't have time to have a conversation with me, but they probably do want to, present their message to more people, right? And that's a great way for them to be able to do that, to reach more people through the power of the podcast. But you could do the same thing on a Facebook Live show.
Right. Or even in a written interview or
a written interview
on YouTube. I mean, like, there's a million ways you could have that happen.
So I would say there's very few people that I would say start a podcast just for the podcasting platform. And I would say if you're going to be like really smart about repurposing that content, start with a video show, even if it's just an interview show, even if it's the exact same content you would put on a podcast, but start it at the video, because you can't take an audio and add video to it. I mean, unless you get like animated.
Great animator.
Exactly, which is but you could start with, putting that on YouTube and then pulling the audio off and putting it on iTunes. I'm saying, like, yes, use the iTunes platform, but there's very few people that I would say start just a podcast, unless you're with like S-Town and NPR.
Right. Well, it seems like now iTunes is really just a distribution channel as opposed to a discovery channel, where it used to be there were so few people relatively podcasting that you could be discovered. you know,
like Jason's first show.
Right. I mean, like pretty much any first show, you know, like,
yeah.
Well, and it was the same way with blogs, like in the early 2000s, let's say. There were so few people doing really well with blogging that you could be discovered just for having a blog.
Right.
Not anymore.
Not anymore.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like not only, so like you said, not thinking of iTunes as a discovery platform, but just one of your distribution channels.
Yes.
And more specifically, spending more time focusing on what makes this show or this podcast or this content different and unique and appealing, and filling a gap in the marketplace that isn't there, because that's what's going to make the distribution channel turn into a discovery channel potentially.
Right.
Because it's something that people haven't heard before, or like, wow, that's really unique, or
Filling
that feels filling a need, versus just doing it because you feel like you need to, right?
Right, for sure. And the other thing I wanted to bring up here that you mentioned was like, it doesn't end with the podcast, right? You put it on iTunes, but then this was our experience. You know, I had a short-lived podcast with 2 other hosts, and we realized that there was so much that needed to go into promoting it, and show notes and graphics, and
it's not easy or cheap.
Facebook. So it was a much bigger undertaking than just recording an episode and putting it on iTunes to make it work. Like, if we realized after about a season, if we were really going to make this work, it would require a lot more time and energy and money than we, as the 3 of us, wanted to invest in that brand. So we let it go. But I think a lot of people think it's just, oh, I'm going to talk and put it on iTunes, but there's a lot more to it.
Yeah, a lot more to it if you want it to stand out and be good, and, you know, work the SEO on the show notes, or get people engaged, like all those things that seem like afterthoughts. They end up taking a ton of time. It's like,
right. Well, and then what are your metrics? Like, we started out talking about numbers. So which of those numbers about a podcast, or about anything really, you focus on to ensure it's actually moving your business forward? Because you were talking about, I mean, go ahead.
I think it also depends on like what your end goal for the like what is the purpose of the podcast, right? And starting there for people. If it's to grow an audience, like again, with the pop-up podcast, that wasn't the goal.
Right. You had a sales goal at the end of that funnel.
Sales goal. And we did, so for my other podcast, The School of Self-Mastery, my goal there is also basically, I never wanted to do sponsors. I wanted to be self-sponsored. And what I mean by self-sponsored is either promoting my own products or leading them towards how do they work with me. And that way I could save my listeners' ears from doing ads all the time and really just self-sponsor. And when we did a feedback, like testimonials with my one-on-one clients, over 60% of them found me through a guest podcast and then listened to the School of Self-Mastery. So I was like, okay, what is the ROI of that? A lot of money, right?
Right.
Because that's my highest offering. And that's why I am confident in saying like, those are much more quality leads than via Facebook ads, because I could tell you how much I've spent, you know, if I went back to my numbers and like looked at how much I've spent on Facebook ads and what those leads have turned into versus people that come in through the podcast, which we track, like who's coming in through the podcast and then who's turning into a client from there. And it's much more quality leads, because people, like, this is so intimate when you're spending time with people and you're doing life with them and you're like,
you're in the gym and you're loading the dishwasher with them,
like on the walk with the kids and all the life things. Like, there was someone who like always had me in her ears when she was doing dishes. Oh, like when I had my first show was a daily show at first. And when I backed it down, it was like really hard for me emotionally to back it down to 3 days a week and then eventually 1 day a week, because I had one listener who was like, I listen to you every day on my morning run. And I was like, oh my God, I'm sorry. Right. Like, I felt bad.
Right.
but it becomes a really intimate experience for people. And so that turns into quality leads. But noticing that they didn't just find me through my own podcast. They found me by leveraging other people's audiences, like John Lee Dumas when I was on Entrepreneur on Fire, Art of Charm when I was on that podcast. Like, how are you leveraging other people's audiences who are in that 1%?
Right.
Bring them back to your show. And that's how you can build an audience and value, like, ROI from the podcast, but starting out with knowing like what your goal is, right? So I think for some people it is audience growth. And how are you tracking that? Well, you can track that straight through your hosting, right? And knowing what those numbers are. But is your goal then what? If you're running like just a sponsorship, that might be
right. That might be an end goal in itself.
Exactly. That might be it for you. But if you are self-sponsored or wanting them to buy your products, then how many people are opting in from each episode? And are you giving them that funnel opportunity at the end of the show?
Right.
Or in the show, right?
And so I would assume that, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I would assume that what's the word I want? Like the time it would take from someone to discover you on a podcast and listen to a bunch of podcasts and then become a one-on-one client is much longer than the average sales cycle, maybe.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like some of them
results sort of thing.
Some of them up to 2 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like
so this is not like I'm going to start a podcast and get a whole bunch of new sales tomorrow.
No, because they're like still getting to know you, and it could happen. Sure. I've actually bought something.
Outliers for sure.
Totally. Like I've actually bought something. It was like a $15,000 coaching mentorship from someone who I would listen to their podcast, and then they made the offer, and it was just timely for me. And I reached out. We had already connected through a mutual friend, but it was just that like I felt like I got to know her over the 3 months that I had been listening every single day. So I think it does take time to build that intimacy, but we should expect that in most high-end interactions, right? Like there's always going to be the outlier who's like, I'm ready to buy. But so that's like a valid reason to have that evergreen content, because we know people binge listen. So once they do find you, they probably are listening, if they like it, and then they might be a faster conversion than someone else.
This has been fascinating. I really enjoy talking about this with you. I know, right? But I do want to be mindful of your time. But yeah, I think this has been such an interesting conversation. Tell people where they can find you and find out more about you and find out about the Shift Show and all that good stuff.
Yeah, so you guys can go to adriennedorison.com. That's the website. It'll link you out to the podcasts. And the Shift Show is something we're doing just on Facebook. So you can go to theshiftshow.biz. We couldn't get theshiftshow.com. Go to theshiftshow.biz, and that'll take you straight to our Facebook page where we're doing live streams now. And then we're talking about the process of the show creation and what that's going to look like. And we should definitely get Jason on here because he's a wealth of knowledge too. Yeah. I just feed off of him. I'm just like the comic relief.
No, you're not.
I'm like, Jason, you're so smart. Just talk.
Yeah, I definitely want to have both of you on soon to talk about that. And the Shift Show, you have to be very careful saying that.
You do. You have to be really careful.
I enjoy it, though. I enjoy it. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Lacey. This was super fun.
Okay, talk soon.